Hey YouTube, today I'm going to be talking about my playthrough of Snowboard Kids 2. If anyone had happened to have seen my thought video on Snowboard Kids 1, you would know that I didn't have a lot of positive things to say about that game, and that overall, I do think that it's not very good. The good news is that I think that Snowboard Kids 2 is a huge improvement over the first one, and if there is a sort of definitive game in the series to experience, in my opinion, it would certainly be the second game. I still don't think this game is by any means some kind of masterpiece or some amazing, incredible game. I think it still suffers from a lot of the things that the first game suffered with, but overall, I think that the game is worth experiencing. Starting off with the positives, I want to talk about the music, which is uh, pretty much the best part of the game, just like Snowboard Kids 1. If there's a takeaway to be had here, if someone decides to not try out this series, I still encourage them to actually search up the OST and listen to the tracks. I will be surprised if after listening to uh, all the tracks for Snowboard Kids 1 and 2 that you won't find at least one song that you'll really like. Moving on to the visuals and the art style, just like the first game, I don't have any complaints at all. I think the game looks quite good. I'm actually a huge fan of the art style, so no complaints there. From my controls perspective, I think the game controls just fine. I don't really have any glaring issues. And I do want to talk about a new mechanic that they actually added in Snowboard Kids 1, I'm sorry, in Snowboard Kids 2 that wasn't in the first game, and it's the ability to deflect red items by jumping and doing a trick. One of my big complaints of the first game is the fact that I felt that there was very little counterplay in dealing with items that the AI will throw at you. And in this game, it always felt like that I had some agency. Like as in, if I was better at the game, I would have the capability of deflecting a lot of the things that get thrown at me, and that is something that the first game was lacking. Moving on to my complaints of this game, once again, the track count is absolutely disgusting. It's such a shame. I really think having a single digit track count is just not excusable, even for an N64 game. Once again, as I referenced in my previous video, Star Wars 64 has 25 tracks. F-Zero X has 20 tracks. Mario Kart 64, I believe, has 16 tracks, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, a single digit track count is just not acceptable to me. Um, 9 tracks in the game, once again. At the very least, I do think that the tracks are a huge improvement over Snowboard Kids 1, so I will give them credit for that. Especially some of the later tracks are actually quite cool. I actually like them a lot. I like the Haunted House track. I like the space track. Honestly, all the second half of the tracks, let's just say the last 4 to 5 tracks are all pretty cool. Now they're not going to hit levels of complexity of Star Wars 64 Racer or even F-Zero, but the tracks were at least memorable. So there is that. Some of the later tracks in Snowboard Kids 1 I thought were just complete garbage. So thankfully, Snowboard Kids 2 improved on that, but I think that there's still much room for improvement. I also want to take another second to talk about the board balance. Um, I still think that the Alpine board, which is the high speed, low handling board, is just not very good. I really don't see the purpose of using it. It was the board that I planned on using when I first fired up the game, and it just doesn't seem worth it at all. Again, due to the items, any lead that you'll build will be negated by the pots and the ghost item. Now, it's not as bad as Snowboard Kids 1. It feels like, I'm not sure if they just changed the routes that the AI takes. Maybe they don't grab the blue boxes as often, but it doesn't seem as relentless as it was in the first game. So, thankfully, I'll also give Snowboard Kids an improvement over the first game in that regard. But I do wish that, um, I guess it's just preference. I just wish the Alpine, there was more of a reason to pick the Alpine board. But I just don't think there is. If someone were to ask me, I think the best board in terms of the starting ones it's just going to be a balance board. Uh, you know, Sacrificing handling for more speed just doesn't really seem that worth it in this game. I'll quickly touch on the final lap syndrome, which is the term I use to describe a huge issue I have with the first game, which is only the third lap mattering. I still think this is prevalent even in Snowboard Kids 2. I mean, I think that's just the nature of this type of game. I just think that it wasn't as frustrating because, as a whole, Snowboard Kids 2 is way less frustrating than the first game. Especially, kind of like I mentioned earlier in the video, you, the player, having some agency in dealing with some of these rare items. They actually also introduce other blue items that will help you in dealing with rare items. For example, the wings. There's a blue item that's a pair of wings that appear on the side of your board, and if you happen to have that, you're able to jump over some of these red items that the AI will shoot at you. I also want to touch on how the AI behaves as well. One of my, probably the biggest complaint I have with the first game is the fact that the AI will only use red items on you, the player, and not on other AI characters. And I can safely say that after reviewing some of my footage, I did see AI characters throw items at other AI characters. Okay, so I think that's a huge improvement. Surely, when the developers were working on the second game, they must have realized that the way they programmed the AI to behave in the first game was just the complete opposite of fun, just extremely frustrating and rage-inducing experience. So I'll give kudos to the game for improving that. This is why I strongly recommend, if anyone wants to experience Snowboard Kids, to just, and you only want to play one of the games, to just play the second one. It's, in my opinion, it's better in just about every conceivable way, except the music, I guess. I'll give that both games equally have amazing music, but every other metric, I think that the second game is an improvement. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the bosses. I've never been a fan of bosses in racing games, and this game is no exception. Some people might like them, but I'm not personally a fan of them. Now, I will say that one of the boss encounters, which was the expert mode dinosaur boss, was actually quite fun. It's, in my opinion, probably the hardest piece of content in the game, and due to its nature, since it's basically a one-lap race against this dinosaur, it was actually fun to sort of figure out a route and basically a rotation and a route of when to use items to win. And when I did pull the win, it was just barely. It was it was very, very close. And that actually took me quite a bit of attempts, but I don't know, I actually kind of enjoyed it. I enjoyed having to engage in the game more than I ever had to, in sort of figuring out, like, okay, I need to take this left or take this right to grab this item and use it at this time. It really did feel like that I had to plan out a good sort of rotation to pull off the win. So I'll give credit to the game for that. But other than that, most the other boss encounters, I mean, they're not offensively bad, but I'm not a huge fan of them. I'd rather, when I play a racing game, I play them to do a race and not to fight a boss. So I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the balancing. This is something that is a difficult topic in my opinion, because one of the things that I did notice in Snowboard Kids 2 is that it is significantly easier than the first game, in the sense that, now I actually played this game, I did the base game, which is essentially the 9 tracks, and then I did all those 9 tracks again on expert mode. When you complete the game, you actually unlock expert mode, and in beating every mission in the single player in expert mode, you actually unlock a special board. But the difficulty in the base game, so, not expert mode, just the base game, is extremely low. I mean, I think I actually ended up clearing every race on my first try, except one, and I had to restart one time. But that actually scratched that. There was one exception to that, and it was the last race, the very last race before the final boss. That actually took me many, many tries. And I've kind of came to the realization that a game like this is just very, very hard to balance. On one hand, when the game is too easy, it's unfortunately kind of boring because the tracks don't really demand that much from you because they're rather simple. And when the game actually gets difficult, it actually starts to become kind of frustrating because a lot of the difficulty doesn't come from the AI driving particularly well or anything like that. It comes from the items. So I think that a game like this is very hard to balance, and I don't really have a solution. But I did want to point that out that you know, I mean, you can pretty much clear this game in probably an hour, honestly, if you choose not to do expert mode. Now I want to talk a little bit more in detail about expert mode. Now, I did one of the big changes that I noticed in expert mode is the fact that the AI will is basically programmed to always deflect when possible. So when you shoot a red item at an AI in expert mode, they will always, if available, like if they're not stuck in some kind of other animation, the AI will always try to deflect the items, which I think is fine. I think that's kind of cool. I would rather have that level of difficulty where you have to sort of rely on winning without the consistency of the items because the AI will always try to deflect them. And for the most part, I found extra mode to be perfectly fine. But another problem with balancing this game is the special boards. So there are some special boards that are obviously kind of a meme. They're kind of a joke. For example, the ice board and the poverty board, which have more negatives than positives. But some boards are just extremely good, just extremely powerful. And the difficulty in the game is so dependent on which board you are selecting that with certain boards, for example, like I think the dragon board is the most broken one. I actually didn't showcase it in my um, review in my playthrough because I didn't end up buying it. It was the most expensive board um, in the shop, and at the time that I unlocked it, I just didn't have the in-game currency to buy it. But after seeing some videos on it, I mean, it's absolutely overpowered. Like you can pretty much trivialize every single instance of the game with the dragon board, and then you have other boards that, like the science board. I think that's what it's called. Or it's the high tech board. I call it the science board, but that is also another overtuned slash overpowered board in the game. And you basically have permanent boost essentially. So does the Dragon Board. I should have talked about that in more detail. The Dragon Board basically gives you a rocket boost and the wings at the cost of low handling, but all those effects are active permanently. And the Science Board gives you permanent uh, fan boost, basically. There's one of the items that's basically a fan that goes on the back of your board and it just gives you a speed boost, and you essentially have that permanently. So, if you do decide to play, even in expert mode with either of these two boards, of course the game's going to be completely trivialized and it's going to be a joke, even in hard mode. Another board I wanted to talk about is the Star board, which is probably the best or the second best board, excluding the first two that I talked about. And there's nothing too notable about it. It's just good in all aspects. It's fast. It's got good handling, and it's gonna class any of the regular boards in the game. So it was actually kind of funny to see that I struggled quite a bit on the first couple of races in expert mode using just the standard boards. Like I was like, oh, this is actually quite hard. And then once I unlocked the star board, the last set of tracks, which are supposed to be harder, were way easier because the starboard is just that strong, right? And then lastly, I did want to talk about the um, charm board, which basically prevents you from being ghosted. So the ghost is one of my most complained about items in the game. Essentially, it attaches itself to whoever's in first place and slows them down. This is why, you know, getting first place finishes and some of these tracks in this game is difficult because even if you do happen to build a lead, you're going to lose that lead eventually. But you're going to get a ghost thrown at you, and you're going to get potted, and then the AI is going to catch up. I think it's a general consensus that the starboard is pretty much the best board in the game, excluding the dragon and the science board, since I would just consider those as just completely broken. But I also want to make the argument that the charm board may actually be better because just being able to play this game without being impacted by ghosts really shows how much the items sort of artificially inflate the difficulty of this game. Um, and it's quite interesting that the final track in extra mode, I was a little worried for it because again, the final track in just the normal mode is what took me the longest. It's the thing that took me the longest thing to clear in the entire game. It's essentially where I got stuck, and it's really telling that I actually cleared that race on my first attempt with the charm board, just because with the charm board you can actually build a lead on the AI by not being affected by ghosts. So in general, I just kind of wanted to give my thoughts on some of the boards. Unfortunately, when it comes to the expert mode, um, I think that if you know what you're doing, in the sense you know which mission unlocks which board, you can sort of have a routing where you basically clear. I think it's the fourth race in the game. I believe it's Wendy's house. Essentially, if you clear that first and you immediately get the starboard, and you could literally clear the dinosaur boss in expert with the starboard, which is what I did. So if you kind of knew like what unlocks what, you can literally unlock the starboard first, and then either unlock the dragon board or the science board, and then literally turn your brain off and unlock every other special board in the game with minimal effort. Um, I didn't end up doing that just because I went into expert mode blind and I did all the races in order. So I didn't immediately have access to the starboard. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I think that if anyone is choosing to pick this game up and try it, probably you're not going to know which boards are insanely good and which ones are crap. And if you play through expert mode in order, I think you'll get a reasonable experience in terms of difficulty. But it is kind of hard to talk about the balancing here because the game can be broken so easily just depending on what board you decide to use. Another positive I wanted to mention in regards to this game is the attention to detail with the story mode. So the story mode is essentially just a set of cutscenes for each race, and they might be kind of primitive and nothing special, but I actually quite enjoyed them. It's probably it might be just nostalgia, but I'll give the game some credit for those. I actually enjoyed watching them again, and another thing I want to give the game some credit for is the costumes. So certain tracks actually give your character a new costume. I believe there are, if I'm not mistaken, 4 or 5 costumes in the game, and that's just a nice little extra touch that I'm gonna give the game some credit for because they didn't have to do that, and I quite enjoyed seeing each character's specific costume. So, lastly, I'll add a little bit of a footnote in regards to the tracks. Yes, there are 9 base tracks in the game, and there are, I believe, 2 other tracks that are tied to, I guess, a type of mini game. There is the mini game where you deliver paper to mailboxes, and then there is the trick course. I didn't really count those because you're not really racing in them, but I guess if you want to be, you want to give the game as much credit as you can, sure, the game has 11 tracks instead of 9. But even if we count 11 as the total track count, I still think that that is way too low for a racing game. One small complaint that I'd like to talk about is the fact that you can't really use the unlockable characters in story mode. I really wouldn't have a problem with this if you could select the difficulty when you do a versus mode race, but I didn't see that option, which means that if you wanted to use any of the unlockable characters, you are basically tied to the game's default difficulty, which is unfortunately a little bit too easy in my opinion. So I kind of wish that the game would have allowed the usage of these extra characters in story mode when you replay through all the tracks in expert mode. So concluding this discussion slash thought video, and just give my closing thoughts on Snowboard Kids 2, I think that this video game is certainly worth playing. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I don't think it's a masterpiece. I don't think it's a 9 out of 10. This is a must-play racing game experience. It really isn't. But it's very non-committal. Again, the game is about an hour long. I think that if you're even remotely a fan of snowboarding games, I think you should give it a shot. And if you're a fan of party racers, I think you should also give this game a chance and just give it a quick playthrough. And overall, I think I can actually recommend this game. Unlike Snowboard Kids 1, I ended up giving Snowboard Kids 1 a 3 out of 10 just because single player experience was just very unenjoyable. And the single player experience in Snowboard Kids 2 is, again, it's not incredible. It's kind of like the inverse of Snowboard Kids 1, where a lot of it is a little bit boring in the sense that if you're even halfway decent, you're going to effortlessly clear most of the races in this game. But I think that the set pieces and the goofy story and the music, I think that is still worth experiencing. So I'm still going to recommend folks that I think this game should be played. In terms of an overall score, I'm honestly pretty torn between giving it a 5 or a 6. I think I'm honestly going to end it with a 5, just because the track count is just something that I cannot forgive. Again, 9 tracks is just absolutely crazy. I think that some tuning should have probably been done in terms of the difficulty. I would almost rather have them make the AI just faster, but maybe keep their item usage on the lower side of things. I am glad that the AI is not as relentless as it was in the first game, because that just led to frustration. But sort of the opposite end of the spectrum here, you know, having you just win in first place with you know, very little effort is also not the solution, in my opinion. But I do understand that at its core, party racing games are going to be harder to balance due to the items. Make the items too strong, and the game is just going to be completely miserable. So yeah, I think I'm going to end with a 5 out of 10, which is probably a little bit harsh, but I easily would have given this game a higher score if it just had more than 9 freaking tracks. I'm still salty about that, considering how good the later tracks are. Um, but yeah, overall, that's pretty much it. And I do recommend folks try out the game, even if it is fairly average.